Hi there, welcome to my kitchen. Today is 2-for-1 day. I'm going to make some scones and I'm also going to make some rock cakes. This is probably something that some of you may not have heard of, but scones that you might also have heard referred to as scones. Most of America that I've been in would refer to them as scones, but I grew up calling them scones, just a difference in pronunciation, but it's the same thing. So what I was interested to find when I came to the United States is that as a bread with meals, Americans will often serve what they call biscuits. When I first came here, I looked at biscuits and I said, that's not a biscuit, that's a scone. So that was kind of an interesting thing. So a scone to me is something like an American biscuit. And we would serve them in Australia as a treat. It's something you'd serve as an afternoon or morning tea, often with a little bit of jam and topped with whipped cream. So it's a treat. It's something you serve when you're having guests. It's not typically a bread item for us, but I've been here long enough that I do often have them as a bread. The other thing that I'm cooking today, which is rock cake, is something I don't think many Americans have heard of, at least none of the ones that I'm familiar with. So the first time I got something called a scone or a scone at an American coffee shop, I was served something that to me looks more like a rock cake. So a rock cake is similar to a biscuit or a scone, but it's usually served with, it's cooked a little bit differently, so we'll talk about that. But it also has more likely to have fruit and things like that in it. So I'm going to go ahead and get started with my scones. So I have in my bowl 2 cups of self-rising flour. And I also have with me a 1/2 cup of butter. So I'm going to slice the butter up into the flour, and then I'm going to rub the butter into the flour. So I'll just demonstrate that here. We'll get the butter into the flour, and then I'll show you. Rubbing the butter into the flour is exactly what it sounds like. You get your hands in there and rub the butter into the flour until it has a similar consistency to breadcrumbs. So it works better if the butter is cold. Unfortunately, my butter has warmed up a little bit, but we will keep working with it anyway. Might be just a little stickier than it would be otherwise. So as you see, I'm going to just rub with my fingertips the butter into the flour. This doesn't take very long, so I'll just work at that for a minute until that's all nicely rubbed in. One of the things that you can do when you're making scones is to add things to them. You don't have to stick to the basic recipe. You can go ahead and add some mixed fruit, some raisins or sultanas, anything you like to just change it up a little bit. If you want it a little sweeter, you could put a tablespoon or 2 of sugar in here. I've seen some interesting things calling themselves scone recipes that have got eggs and all sorts of things in them that to me makes them more like a rock cake than a scone. So we are getting here. We just about have that all mixed in. We still have a few lumps of butter that are not mixed in too well yet. So I'll just keep working here for another minute. So there we go. I think we are just about done there. Now if you don't want to use butter or you don't have any butter on hand, you could use margarine or a vegetable shortening. Whatever you typically cook with will work just fine. So you can see there that the butter is mixed in nicely with the flour. And we'll go ahead to the next step. So I'm going to make a little bit of a well in the bottom of my mix here. Then I'm going to add milk to this. This will take about a cup of milk, but I generally don't measure this. I usually just go by how it looks. So, and once you start putting the milk in and mixing this, you want to handle it as little as possible. If you handle it too much, the scones will become heavy. So I'll put some milk in there and mix that in together until all of the flour and butter mix is nicely dampened. Now this will be much wetter than, say, a pastry. A pastry, when it's done, is fairly dry. The scone mixture should be quite damp, quite almost wet. So that is, actually that looks about done. So I'm going to push that off my spoon. It's quite sticky. I'll need to flour my hands once I'm working with this. So I will flour my surface here very generously. I'll flour my hands so that I can work with this without it sticking too much. And I will just put the mixture onto my baking sheet here. Then I'll sprinkle some more flour on top here. And I'll just pat that down, depending on how big I want the scones to be. Probably about 3/4 of an inch to an inch. Pat that down. Then I'll take a glass. If you have a cookie cutter that's about the right size that you want your biscuits, you use that. I don't have a cookie cutter, so I'll use a glass. These will be kind of large, but that's okay. So I'll get about 4 out of this, and then I will mix the remaining back together to make some more. So when you have these, you flour them well. Make sure they're well floured or they'll stick. Take a cookie sheet or pan and place the scones into the pan with the sides touching. Make sure there's plenty of flour on them. And I'm going to put them in so that they're actually touching the side of the pan as well. If you want to use a parchment paper or some kind of baking paper on the bottom of the pan, feel free, but it shouldn't be necessary. So put this back together. Just press it in gently. Sprinkle it with flour again and get another couple. Push this together and get another one. So this is making 7. I would have thought it would make more, probably because my glass is so big that I'm using to cut them out. So I'm going to have 7. I'd say typically you'd get 8. I may have done those a little bit thick as well, those first ones. But there they are. I'll put those in the oven at 400 degrees for about 15 to 20 minutes. Well, I forgot to preheat the oven, so it's not ready for my scones. So I've put them in the refrigerator. I'm going to mix up my rock cake, and I'm actually going to put my rock cakes in the oven first because they don't need quite as hot an oven. So there's my oven heated up for the rock cake. So I'm going to cook them at 375 degrees. They require a moderately hot oven, which is around 375. If you go to my Facebook page, I will put up a little chart that explains the different temperatures of where you might see a recipe that says a moderate oven or moderately hot or hot. It's good to have a guide handy to check out what those temperatures are. So I'm going to bake the rock cakes at 375, and then once they come out of the oven, I will turn the temperature up to 400 so that I can go ahead and do the scones. So let's go ahead and mix up the rock cakes. Right, now you've already seen the rubbing of the butter into the flour. So I have already done that. I have my 2 cups of flour. And in this case I'm actually using a margarine and not a butter, just because it sort of saves on the butter, which is a little bit more expensive than the margarine. So I have 2 cups of flour with half a cup of margarine rubbed in. So now I'm going to add 1 cup of fruit. Now today I'm going to use cranberries and raisins mixed in together. It helps if the package is open. So I did tear it where it said to tear here, but it decided not to open. So we'll just trim a little bit more of that off. Don't you just hate that? I said tear here and tear here doesn't work. It still doesn't work. I want to still be able to reseal the package when I'm done, so there we go. So the other thing that works well with this would be a fruitcake mix. In Australia, I used to be able to get a fruitcake mix in a box, similar to how these raisins are packaged. And it wasn't as wet. Here in the United States, my fruitcake mix that I buy comes in a tub, and it's wetter. It has corn syrup or something mixed in with it. So it's not as dry as the mixed fruit that I would use for a fruitcake in Australia. So when it comes to doing a fruitcake recipe or my plum pudding recipes, then I have to moderate that recipe a little bit. But since I don't tend to follow a recipe exactly anyway, that is just fine because that would happen anyway. So here we go. We have a few more raisins in here. We have about a cup of fruit, so I'll mix that in together with it. Now in Australia I would use mixed spice, but since that doesn't happen in the US, I'm using pumpkin pie spice, which is a mixture of cinnamon, ginger, nutmeg, allspice. I'm going to use about 1/8 of a teaspoon of mixed spices or pumpkin pie spice. Throw that in. Mix that together. And then I'm going to make a well for my wet ingredients to go in. So for the wet ingredients we use an egg. Oh, I forgot sugar. That's okay. We can go ahead and put the sugar in. We're not that far along. So about 1/3 of a cup of sugar. And mix that in. That wouldn't have been very good, would it? And not have the sugar in there. We'd have still eaten them. That'd have been more like a scone. There we go. Mix that in. So for my wet ingredients, I have an egg, and I'm going to put in 1/2 cup of milk, mixed in with my egg. A teaspoonful or so of vanilla. And mix that together a little. Just mix that in so that it blends nicely. You're not trying to whip it or anything. Just mix it together. And mix it in to the dry ingredients. Now this mixture will be a little bit drier than a scone mixture as well, so that's another difference. There we go, we're getting it mixed. It's more the consistency of a cookie dough than a scone. So get these out of the way. We get a cookie sheet or pan for these. And we'll put these on the pan an inch or 2 away from each other because these will spread out as they cook. So we'll put about a tablespoon, just like doing a drop biscuit. This over here where you can see it a little better. I haven't made these for a long time, so I hope they will turn out okay. Well, someone came to the door and I had to stop anyway. So I decided to go ahead and put these onto a bigger pan. So let's just see how this works. These all on here. I think I'm doing these a little bit smaller than they would typically be done. But that's okay. If I do them smaller, then I end up with more rock cakes, don't I? That's probably why the one pan wasn't working out for me. I don't want to use two. It has been a long time. I think I might have made these one time when my older girls were young, but everybody's grown now, so it's not something that I would make very often. So I'm going to pop these in the oven I'm going to check on them in about 15 minutes. I would think that typically they would take about 20 or so, but I'm going to check them in 15. Hi, there's a few minutes before the rock cakes will come out of the oven. So I just wanted to add a little recipe note in here that if you don't have self-rising flour on hand, you can substitute for each cup of self-rising flour. You can use 1 cup of all-purpose flour and either a teaspoon of baking powder, a 1/4 teaspoon of baking soda and 1/2 teaspoon of salt, or you can use just 1½ teaspoons of baking powder and 1/2 teaspoon of salt. I've also seen it written up with just a 1/4 teaspoon of salt, so that's probably something you can adjust a little bit to your taste depending on whether there's any other salt in your recipe that you're using. So I just thought I'd add that little note. You'll also see that on my Facebook page. I'll add some recipe notes from time to time, plus the recipes will be on the Facebook page. So feel free to just do a quick search of Facebook for recipes optional, and you'll find my page with links to the videos, plus some tips and hints. So my timer is about to go off. I checked these at 15 minutes and then I decided to go ahead and leave it for the other 5. So they've been in the oven for 20 minutes and I'm getting ready to take them out. So there's my timer. Now I've already looked at these. They're starting to turn nicely brown on the top. And turn my timer off, and I'm going to reset my oven up to 400 so I can put the scones in. So they look really good, so we'll get them over here onto our trivets and then you can get a close-up look. So there are my rock cakes out of the oven. I'll let them cool on the pan for a few minutes, and as soon as my oven beeps, I will pop my scones in. So it's time for our scones to come out of the oven. they did take an extra couple of minutes because I did a couple of them a little bit big, so I let them cook a couple of minutes longer. Now these are not very brown on top. If you wanted them to be a little browner, you could just put a little milk on top, just like I did with the peach pies. Get a pastry brush, brush some milk on top before you put them in the oven. Now what we always did with scones when I was a kid, I haven't seen it in the instructions for the scones, but we always wrapped them in a clean towel. So I'll give this a minute and take them off the pan and put them on a clean towel. What that does, it helps keep them moist. That steam helps moisten them, keeps them soft. So I'll take them out of the pan and put them onto the towel. Yeah, these are a little bit big. I need to find a smaller glass. I probably should have been able to get 10 or 12 scones out of that mix, but we just wrap them up in the towel, and that's how we keep them until we're ready to eat them. So let's have a little taste test of these rock cakes. They look really good. So I'm going to break one open. They look very good. Now, these are not very sweet, which is just how I like them. But if you want them sweeter, feel free to add a little bit more sugar. The cranberries are adding just a little bit of tartness every now and then, which is nice. So you can use different kinds of fruit, whatever your imagination can come up with. Enjoy these with a cup of tea or a cup of coffee or a glass of milk. They're perfect for entertaining or just sitting at home enjoying the company of your family. So thanks for joining me today. Have a great day. Bye.